energy transition. For instance, this is a clip from a European newspaper of 2 days ago, and there they argue that there is a clean energy transition, which is clearly a global trend, that it is a moral necessity, and that also makes perfect economic sense. What I will argue, and I think the two other members of the panel will share, is that there is not such a global trend, and that the transition as this conceived today as led by the market it doesn't really make economic sense. And there are some facts that prove that. We also quite often see in the media that the main transnational corporations are all engaged in this energy transition and that they are quite committed. For instance, this is another clip from another newspaper. Actually, this is not from a newspaper, this is more from an environmental NGO, and they praise the fact that big corporations such as Facebook, for instance, are supposedly investing quite a lot in this transition. For instance, Facebook has announced that they will cut their greenhouse emission by 75%, and that by the year 2020, all their operations are supposed to be based on clean, renewable energy. So we could have some discussion about what this really means, but I think we can leave that for debate. And then we can also see quite often reference to Germany, for instance, as the leading country in this energy transition. And it is true that there has been quite a lot of progress in Germany, but we also have to look at the dark side or the other side of the German energy transition. Because, for instance, we cannot forget that Germany remained the main European burner of gas, even today. And this also relates to, of coal, for instance, today. And this also relates to another fact that we usually see in the media, that they try to convince us that we shouldn't only be concerned about the expansion of non-conventional renewables such as wind or solar, but we could also think of other clean alternatives. For instance, some people are presenting gas as a much cleaner alternative. And I think we have to challenge those kind of assumptions. Then when we talk about the energy transition, we also have to be very much aware that there is a real trend towards the rise of renewable, but we cannot forget that generation and consumption still relies very heavily on fossil fuels. For instance, this is what I say, that Germany remains one of the largest burner of coal in Europe. And then when we look at the global level, the picture is not so different. This is something that I took from a TUED report. I think Sean can explain it more in detail. But the most important thing is that when we look at the trend in the past 2 decades, 1997 to 2017, we see that there has been practically no change in the correlation of different sources of power generation, electricity generation. This is a picture that graph that comes from BP. They produce every year an annual report, and see that they talk about non-fossil energy. So they combine what could be big hydro and non-conventional sources of energy. So we can be happy that wind and sun might be growing, but for the climate, this is totally irrelevant, because what we should be worried about is that the participation of coal, oil, and gas in power generation hasn't changed anything. Maybe it got even worse when we look at this picture. And this has to do with projection. This is a graph that maps what can be expected between now and the year 2040. And once again, we see that the green part, the renewables, keep growing, but coal, natural gas, nuclear, and petroleum also keeps growing. And for the planet, for the climate, it's not really important how many windmills, how many solar parks we can construct all around the world. What matters is the amount of coal, gas, and oil, and that's really worrisome. So we can really discuss how much of a transition are we experiencing today. And finally, and I think this might really make us think, is that there is a very recent and clear fall in renewable energy investment that threatens climate goals. And this is not something that the left is saying. This is something that is being discussed, for instance, in almost weekly articles in the Economist, in the Financial Times, in business pages and business sites that monitor changes in the energy sector. And almost all of them lead to a falling rate of investment in the power sector. For instance, this is an article that was published by the Financial Times, and they gave quite a lot of attention to the most recent annual report of the International Energy Agency that shows a big drop in the investments in renewable energy, mainly private investment, between 2017 and 2016. I'm going very quickly here because I think Sean will explain all these trends more in detail. Then, what about energy democracy? What is energy democracy? And I put it here as a question mark because, as I will say it more in detail in a minute, I think energy democracy remains quite a lot a very northern country. In Europe, in the US, there's a lot of discussion about energy democracy, but in the South, there is something, this is a quite new concept because for some reasons that I will explain, for instance, I come from Latin America, we prefer not to talk about democracia energética, what would be energy democracy in Spain, but more about energy sovereignty or energy justice that are more relevant, perhaps, to our history and our present situation, not only in relation to energy, but also the legacy of colonialism and other problems. So energy democracy means much more than a transition to renewable sources. So when we talk about energy democracy, we are not only talking about replacing the old energy model for a new energy model based on non-renewables. And this is quite important because this implies some discussion with some progressive NGOs. For instance, 3 years ago, we were in a similar conference organized by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Brussels, and there were people from Greenpeace. And what they argue quite strongly is that it didn't really matter to have a public provider, community provider, market-driven provider. What mattered was to have strong investment in renewables because the urgency of climate change is so big that we cannot wait to find the perfect solution. So for them, public ownership, for instance, is not really a matter that should be discussed in the way we are discussing. I think we should discuss public ownership, not because it's an ideological position, because some data shows that we cannot expect the private sector to provide the solution that we need. And this is clearly explained in one briefing paper that TUED published 6 months ago, I think, about the importance of public ownership. So when we talk about energy democracy, I like something that TUED say already 4 or 5 years ago when they first published this paper, where the unions argue quite strongly that the energy transition can only occur if there is a decisive shift in power toward workers, community, and the public. And this is energy democracy. And this is summarized in something that we all like, and Sean can explain in more detail because he came up with this idea that has to do with resist the current energy system led by the fossil fuel industry to reclaim the existing public or socially owned energy system, and also to restructure. For instance, how to restructure Eskom in South Africa, or how to restructure other still functioning and in some cases quite strong public utilities that we can find we can find in other parts of the world. And finally, I think this is quite obvious, energy democracy is all about greater democratic control of energy systems. And this implies, for instance, that the fight for energy democracy is not only restricted to the electricity sector, it has to do with the energy system as a whole. And it combines the struggles about alternatives to climate change, but also struggle to privatization, for instance. And this implies the participation of many different social movements. And I think this picture is quite interesting because it exemplifies the whole notion of energy democracy. This picture comes from the occupation of Standing Rock in the US against the construction of a pipeline, the Dakota pipeline. And here some unions related to TUED, for instance, were using the concept of energy democracy as a way to explain why they were there, why the nurses, for instance, were fighting together with the indigenous organization of the area against the construction of this pipeline. The concept of energy democracy, as I said before, I think should be adapted to the conditions and the need of the South. I'm saying this because what I see quite often is that, especially in Europe, there is a very idealized understanding of energy democracy as something that is necessarily very micro, very local, community energy, run by cooperatives, etc. And I'm not saying these are not a good solution. In fact, I am a member of an energy cooperative in Amsterdam, and I'm quite happy, but I would prefer that in the Netherlands there was a public utility that would be responsible for the provision of electricity services, but it doesn't exist. And what it works in Europe, for instance, these kind of cooperatives, I don't think can be translated the same model to other parts of the world. So what I think is that the scope of energy democracy should not be restricted to the local and the communitarian level. For instance, to think of countries such as Costa Rica, where they have a very well-functioning, efficient, quite green national public energy system, and to think about that only as cooperatives would be unthinkable. But we can also think of a combination of different models of public and social ownership. And in that case, Costa Rica, again, can be a good example because they have a very good public utility, like a Costa Rican Eskom, but a good Eskom. But they also have three very strong rural energy cooperatives that are quite big, and they have three municipally owned public utilities. And they are all part of an integrated public power system. For instance, the three cooperatives, they identify themselves as public enterprises, even though they have a cooperative model of ownership and management. And I think the idea of energy democracy challenges the whole system of power beyond purely energy, oil, climate issues. I took this picture 6 years ago in Mexico when the electricity workers union was fighting against the closure of the metropolitan utility. They lost that battle. And this was before the whole idea of energy democracy had expanded. For instance, these workers were not interested in climate change. They were not interested on climate issues. They were interested on keeping their jobs, and their struggle was all about that. If we go now back to Mexico, we see that the discourse has changed. They are concerned about jobs, but they also have integrated into their discourse, the same union, some other values that have to do with the bigger idea of energy power. So to finalize, I would like to say a few things about why public ownership matter. The first thing is that after decades of failed privatization, public ownership is back in the political agenda. We see this in the UK, for instance. Public ownership is once again in the political agenda of New Labour, or, well, I shouldn't use New Labour, the Corbyn side, as some can explain. And the idea of public ownership is been coming up in many other places. I would recommend to read a special issue of the New Internationalist that was published 3 months ago that maps the current upsurge of public ownership, showing that it can be done and it can be done better in the common interest. I took this phrase from the editorial of the New Internationalist, and I ask you to remember this. It can be done, and it can be done better in the common interest, because I will refer to that phrase again before I finish. And we have been mapping from the TNI side this trend, and we can see that there are many processes of republicization, in some places or countries that we have no idea about, and it has to do not only about the energy sector, it has to do with the water sector, it has to do with the telecoms, it has to do with waste management, it has to do with health, education, and many other sectors where we see that privatization has been reversed. I'm not going to go in detail into that, but I brought some copies of this book, and it's available also on the TNI website. But we see some quite impressive trends. For instance, this graph maps what has been happening between the year 2000 and last year, and we see a lot of process of reversion of privatization going on all around the world. So we see deprivatization or republicization as a very strong trend that we can find in Europe, in Latin America. We don't have many cases from Africa, but we hope to get more cases in the near future. And then to finalize, I want to come back to that phrase from the editorial of the Internationalist that has to do with something that can be done and can be done better. And I think this is important to reflect on the case of Uruguay, my country. The case of Uruguay became quite famous in the context of the COP of the Paris summit some few years ago. And there was a lot of media coverage that presented the Uruguayan case as a real revolution, because in a matter of only 4 years, Uruguay had managed to change radically its energy mix. And more recently, this is an article from April this year. Also, research centers, NGO, even business organizations focusing on trends in the energy sector are looking at the case of Uruguay. For instance, this institute based in Cleveland in the US, they say that Uruguay offers a profoundly instructive example that can be applied elsewhere and in any number of other countries. The whole process began in the year 2005, when the left came into national government. We had a broad coalition that includes from the communists to the former guerrilla, the Tupamaro, the socialists, the progressive Christian, labor, progressive intellectuals, etc. And the Frente Amplio managed to introduce in parliament an energy bill with a long-term strategic plan, and this was supported by all the parties represented in parliament. This picture was taken the day that bill was passed in parliament. And here we can see some of the changes. In blue, we can see hydro. It hasn't really changed. In red, we can see thermal, which is basically burning oil and gas. What is more impressive is the purple side. And we can see that in a matter of less than 5 years, the participation of wind has increased dramatically. And here we can see it more clearly. So in 2011, there were only 43 megawatts, and you can see that that participation has been multiplied almost exponentially until this year. And in May this year, wind became the main source of power generation in Uruguay, even displacing hydro. Now 42% of electricity generation in Uruguay comes from wind. So there is no other country on earth that have this sustained participation of wind in the electricity. But And with this, I will finalize. Not everything is good in the case of Uruguay. And this has to do with the previous conversation about IPPs in South Africa, because we see a quite similar picture in some way. We have a very efficient public company. It's not like Eskom. People like UTE. People like the quality of services provided by the electricity company. And we fought against the privatization of this company, and we won that battle. And we can see that this is only wind generation. We can see that the national public utility has invested quite a lot, 35%, in its own wind park. But we see a large participation of private. And this is a problem, because we see the same problems that you were mentioning here, 20-year contract, guarantee payments, even if the national company doesn't need the energy, business almost without any risk for private investor, and so on. So we see that as something quite problematic. That's why the Power Sector Union, for instance, is talking about the privatization of the wind sector. I'm not so sure if we could use that word, because we cannot forget how much the public enterprise, the state-owned enterprise, has invested, which is more than 35%, in fact, because the public utility took care of changing the whole grid to make it compatible with wind. So the participation of the private sector wouldn't have been possible without the existence of a well-functioning and efficient public utility. And all that investment is not, does not appear in this graph. But I think we have to be concerned about this kind of trend. So I'm going to finalize here, and I will leave the space to Sam to hear more about the UTED.
I've got a PowerPoint as well.
Is the light?
Yeah.
In a minute. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm just going to stand up if that's okay. It just makes me a little bit easier to speak and read that screen and keep putting my glasses on. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you and be part of this conference. I think it's a real privilege to be able to come from the UK, and I bring solidarity from my trade union, Public and Commercial Services Trade Union, to you all. And I think, as echoing the points that were made in the first sessions about, I will talk in a very UK perspective about what's happening in the UK and the political space that's been opened up around specifically the energy democracy agenda. And I won't go into details. I think Daniel's covered some of it, and obviously Sean will talk a bit more about the TUED initiative. But I think we can't solve the problems of climate change in silos of our own trade unions or in our own national context. So it's very important for us to be learning from you and the challenges that you're facing in South Africa, and what I can take back. So I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of context to who are PCS, which is the acronym for trade union. We're a civil service trade union. We've currently got 180,000 members, and I put in there where we were in 2008, because that is after 10 years of austerity government and a very particular attack on our trade union by the Tory government, the coalition government, because our members actually work for the government. So that is our employer, and they have very systematically targeted us. But they've also wanted to reduce the size of government. They're very anti-public sector, as you might imagine. So we've now got the smallest civil service since the Second World War. We've now got the smallest public sector overall, which is the reason why I sort of emphasize that is because obviously when we're talking about public ownership, what we've actually seen in the past 10 years is an absolute hollowing out of the institutions and jobs to deliver a kind of energy democracy framework. So in a way, we are aligned with other public sector trade unions that this would actually be a real job creator if we had energy back under public ownership in terms of how we deliver, and that would it's about going into the details of it. But we cover a range of functions in our union. We deliver the welfare system, we collect the taxes, we run national museums and art galleries. So we've got quite a broad stead, and the commercial side is those contracts which have been privatised over the years, not just in the past 10 years, but systematically, mainly around outsourcing of information technology functions and things like this. But we have a very important role, but we're seen as a left and progressive trade union. So obviously we're quite often a threat and challenging government policy, particularly in welfare and a range of things. But we also have a policy in monitoring regulatory functions. So a lot of our members are working in key departments. So one of the key ones there is the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which is where energy policy gets made. So our members are actually working on these issues. And again, I mention that because part of the problem we've had in this debate is that the energy unions say, well, it's nothing to do with you. You don't have members in the sector. Well, I think in line with what Danielle said and what Sean will say, we believe that everybody's an energy worker. We all rely on energy, whether it's directly in our jobs to get us to work, within our homes, within our communities. So we believe that everybody's got a stake in this debate. I mean, obviously there's different levels to that, but we say we've got a clear stake in this. And we have members in the regulatory authority, which is the Ofgem, as it's called. As part of that response, we produced this pamphlet, which you see up there last year, which really is based on trade unions' sort of energy, democracy, resist, reclaim, restructure, and how we can actually build this as part of a programme for just transition, looking at a civil service trade union perspective. So whilst this talks about just transition, we've also put in there that we actually see this as a transformative transition. This is a political thing. This isn't just about a green job swap, so those losing energy workers losing jobs will get new jobs in renewables. This is about looking at our overall economy, and I think the comrade from NUMSA was saying this earlier. This is about actually looking at our economy, looking at the inequalities, obviously the capitalism and the role that that has played, and the austerity agenda. And we're also participating in the Million Climate Jobs campaign in the UK, and was one of the founder unions in that in the UK. But it's obviously about giving power back to people and workers properly within the socialising ownership. At the end, National Climate Service, that's one of the key demands of the Million Climate Jobs campaign in the UK, is saying that we can only, if we have a government body overseeing the transition to climate change and energy, will this ever happen, and obviously within a public sector frameworks, not within a privatised transition. So what we set out in here is how we envisage a civil service that has a national climate service, and what would these sort of new departments look like. And I've got a few copies if anyone's interested to see that. We have members in Ofgem. This is the independent regulator that was set up when the gas and electricity sectors were privatised through the 80s and 90s. And I've just put in there this affordability, security, sustainability, because obviously this is part of this energy trilemma that often gets talked about, which came from the World Energy Forum, but is often referenced in the UK context about what the government needs to do. And obviously one of the key roles of Ofgem is to develop markets and competition. So obviously what we envisage, that Ofgem would no longer exist in our new world of public ownership, and I'm pleased to say our members in Ofgem are fully supportive of this and the union's position, and actually would rather be working in a new kind of public sector democratic energy model. But coming back to those points, just to sort of where we are at the moment in the UK with energy, highly unaffordable. We've got vast numbers in fuel poverty. Obviously they increase once fuel poverty is what's called a devolved issue in the UK. So Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales have their own policies of dealing with fuel poverty. We have our own in England. We've seen huge hikes in the energy costs, which won't be any surprise, but whilst we've got all this debate raging at the moment over the past couple of years, we're actually seeing more price hikes going on this year. 2 announcements this year. The big energy companies who control the market by and large who act as a cartel, basically. So when one puts their prices up, the others will sort of hang around for a couple of weeks. But they obviously all do this in agreement and then start to collude over time to put their prices up. A little, which often doesn't get talked about in the UK context, is network operator costs, who take huge profits from the system, which go on to domestic energy bills. Obviously in the UK, we have a totally privatised energy system, one of the few in the world. So all parts of it, from generation, transmission, distribution and supply, is all privatised. Sustainability, now this comes back to some of the points about are we winning on renewables? Well, we have increased around some of the renewables contribution to power generation in the UK, 18.2% in 2017. That's the latest figures just out a couple of months ago from the government department. So not massive, but it's slowly increasing. But of overall energy, it's still only 2.7%. So that's obviously not just power generation, but goes for heating as well. One problem we have specifically in the UK is gas. We are highly dependent on gas for domestic heating, buildings heating. So it's becoming a very big space of debate at the moment. But even 40% gas in power generation. So when we came out of coal in the 80s and 90s, aside of that being a very political attack on the workers in the former coal fields, that was all part of what they called the dash for gas at the time. They were trying to get everybody over to putting more gas into power generation because of North Sea oil and gas resources. But we peaked oil and gas from the North Sea oil and gas around 2000, so we're now becoming a net importer. So our own sort of security of supply or energy sovereignty is actually decreasing. So again, this starts to feed into arguments around gas supply and where we get our energy from. Another sort of wider context, I know unfortunately you had to put up with Prime Minister Theresa May in South Africa last week. But one thing that's happening right now, we keep talking about, oh, we're near, we've got high records of employment in the UK. We do not. We've got lots of underemployment, lots of false statistics going around. A lot of people in precarious work, very low wages. We've had high wage stagnation over the past decade under the austerity policies, but now we've got over 1 million people, and that figure's increasing daily, reliant on food banks, so voluntary handouts just to get food for people to feed their children, etc. Now, we used to say that people had a choice of whether to heat or eat. What's emerging now is people have a choice whether to heat, eat, or pay their rents, because housing costs in the UK are enormously high. I mean, also that varies from area to areas, but that's again the sort of context in which we're in. I mean, within PCS ourselves, we've just had a ballot on national pay. We're subject to a pay cap at the moment by the government. 40% of our members who administer the system actually themselves have to get in work, what we call in-work benefits, because their pays have actually gone backwards over the past 10 years. So that's the kind of context we're economically working in, and the sort of social context that people are in. The government response, well, because there's been a lot of concern in the media and politically, so they keep saying that, well, we're going to cap the energy prices. That's not happening. They've done a small thing. They're tweaking around. So if you're on a prepayment meter, they're going to just limit how much you can be charged on that. What they keep telling us that, well, actually, it's your fault because you're paying too high a tariff. You need to be getting in touch with your supplier, changing your tariff. There's thousands of different tariffs in the UK, and who has the time to keep looking at what's the latest and the best tariffs? Obviously, smart meter. There's a program rolling in smart meters, so people can keep an eye on their tariffs. But again, there's a lot of social resistance to smart meters at the moment because of fears of being cut off, fuel poverty and vulnerability. In terms of energy policy, it's an absolute mess at the moment. The government is promoting fracking, so shale gas extraction and nuclear. Nuclear, if it goes ahead in the way in which it's proposed, we will probably have the most expensive electricity in the world, because what they call the strike price, the guaranteed rate that they're going to give for the energy is about, I think, £90.2 what it is for kilowatt. I always get lost in these figures, but anyway, it's way over the top for what they'd be paying, but we'll be stuck into that deal for years and years to come. In the meantime, they've been rolling back on any good policy that there was. So they cut the feed-in tariffs, so it wiped out the solar industry overnight, 12,000 jobs went in solar. Things like zero carbon homes, all new builds were supposed to be zero carbon by 2018, that's all been scrapped, so everything's rolling back. Where we are developing renewables, that's all mainly privately owned, and this just gives a picture of who owns the wind in the UK at the moment, and it's offshore wind because they blocked onshore wind development because that's not very popular with kind of the landed gentry in the UK who don't like wind turbines in their backyards, but they don't mind having fracking and hydraulic drill sites as long as it's not in their backyard for what they call the working class desolate north. But this was from a report called Who Owns the Wind Owns the Future, which is a really good little report that was produced last year for the Labour Energy Forum, which is a group of energy specialist campaigners who are members of the Labour Party, but it's not a Labour Party organisation, but obviously work closely with developing some of their policy. So what has changed in the UK in the past couple of years? The election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the Labour Party, and now finally having a more progressive left, which has given us all some hope and something to actually fight for and coalesce around. But really, when the manifesto came out in 2017, when the snap election was called, I think we were all quite shocked, actually, and pleasantly surprised by some of the things that we saw in there. And we do have a UK Trade Unions for Energy Democracy sort of coalition or group of trade unions, and we put a submission into the manifesto process beforehand, highlighting obviously some of these things around public ownership. But this is Jeremy Corbyn from the quote up there from February 2018, which I think we all saw as one of his most progressive speeches that he did, both on climate change, on just transition, and where the Labour Party was going on energy. Obviously, they've made this commitment, 60% energy from clean, renewable sources by 2030, public investment into nuclear. Nuclear is a tricky one, which I'll come back to, but public ownership of electricity and gas networks, so that's the transmission and distribution side, publicly owned regional supply companies, and support for displaced energy workers. So again, this is the first time they're getting into some just transition type guarantees of how they will look after workers coming out of the energy sector. Now, that's good as far as it goes. But also in 2017, at Trade Union Congress, which is the UK umbrella body for the trade union movement, this motion was unanimously passed. And it was quite an historic moment because the year before, we'd had a very big debate on climate change and energy, which showed a very divided trade union movement, which came down to a sort of binary debate of jobs versus the environment, which most of you will be familiar with. So it was quite incredible that we actually got this motion through, and it was brought by the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union, which is quite a small union in the UK, but it has a very long tradition, quite an old union, I think it's around over 100 years old, who are playing a really good role in the energy debate in the UK and giving quite an interesting perspective, because up until this time, it's really been the public sector unions that have been probably more progressive and leading around climate change and the energy discussions. So the Bakers are obviously a private sector union, but they're starting to understand the threat of climate change to their members' jobs and their industries, and their employers are as well. So it's really good that they're actually taking this lead. I've just highlighted two specific things in there. Obviously is the issue of public ownership and democratic control of the energy system. We are unanimous across that in the unions in the UK. We're not when it comes down to points of detail, but on the principle, there's no problem there. And then obviously lobbying for a just transition strategy. So this was a really big movement on the side of the unions last year. But obviously with any motion, as you know, it depends what happens with it afterwards and then how practically that gets implemented. So I think now, just to highlight some of the problems are actually now starting to emerge. And I say in one sense, when I call them problems or issues, in a way it's a good thing, because our debate has moved on so far in the past year, and this kind of shows how far it's come. There is concern in the unions, actually the Labour Party is being too cautious on its approach. We'd actually like to see more public ownership, and particularly the energy unions would like to see public ownership of the utility companies. These are what we call the big six. These are the main players in the UK energy markets, because one of the problems we've got right now is that the Labour Party's proposal will encourage regional energy companies to compete with the big six, but the big six actually are highly unionised, have good jobs, because actually when they got privatised, a lot of those workers were protected in their pay terms and conditions. So there's a potential of a big conflict that's going to happen if the Labour Party doesn't sort this out with the trade unions, hopefully before they get elected. So this is one of them. The energy mix. Now, the motion which I just showed intentionally didn't touch on the energy mix. It went more around principles of consensus. We've got a really big conflict around nuclear fracking and hydrogen. And when I say hydrogen, that's gas-based, methane-based hydrogen. That's partly because the big energy unions, obviously high concentrations of members in those industries, not fracking. Fracking is still a nascent industry, but unfortunately the GMB, which is the big gas union in the UK, is already organising, not we say they shouldn't organise workers if the fracking does develop, but they've already signed agreements with the industry and they are promoting fracking. Now, even some of the big unions against that, the public sector unions against fracking, and the communities are against fracking. So that has been a big source of debate. But one reason why fracking is being supported particularly is when it comes to hydrogen and gas. And I think Daniel made a reference to this about talking about gas as sort of clean gas and low carbon. There's a whole rebranding that's going on at the moment in the UK around gas. And so you now start to see these things, low carbon gas, clean gas, hydrogen gas, without people really understanding the terminology, or it's carbon free at the point of use. So but the unions have been in hot with the gas companies to actually go on this exercise, unfortunately. So we are stuck here, and we're stuck within these kind of models of highly centralized power generation also, which is starting to impede now some of the debate around energy transition and public ownership. The other thing which is of concern is there's now a narrowing of the just transition debate. These words are becoming highly contested in the UK context. Some of the unions don't like it, they want to throw it out. We have to keep pointing out, well, it's actually now the language of the international trade union movement, it's in the Paris Climate Agreement. So what we then decide it to mean is something else. It's up to us to articulate that and give it meaning, whether we like those two words or not. But this is becoming the debate. But it's also being tried to squeeze the debate down to energy workers only, and saying it's nothing to do with anybody else. We should be the ones that are leading all this discussion, which again, we would highly disagree with. And we've come back to the Bakers Union, and one reason why they've been leading some of this debate, they had this good story, although it's not a good story in the realities of it. Up in the northwest of the UK, where they're trying to develop fracking, there's a biscuit factory of a very large brand, a popular brand where people get their biscuits from. And that factory will actually be under threat from fracking. So what we're trying to say is, well, coming back to this thing, that energy is everybody's business. So actually, whilst you're promoting the fracking jobs, you're putting at risk the jobs of those workers in that factory. So we have to start looking at this whole debate in a different way. So whilst unfortunately it's becoming very narrow and becoming just a sort of skills and retraining exercise, we're moving away from the sense of solidarity, not just with workers in the UK, but more global solidarity and things which underpin us as trade unions and labour activists. And I just put there, it's always hard to get figures, as I'm sure it is here, on direct numbers who actually work in energy, who's being included, who isn't being included, but that's roughly the figures at the moment. And most of those jobs are actually in North Sea oil and gas. Lots have gone out of that sector over the past few years using the reduction in the oil prices to get rid of workers, lower health and safety standards, and attack pay terms and conditions as well. So employment isn't going up, even though that's supported by the government with lots of tax breaks and subsidies. But it's not actually creating more jobs up there. I've just put in a little bit around the actual trade union figures, because I think this is relevant in terms of our power and what we can actually do. Only 23.5% of trade union members in the UK, and even fewer covered by collective bargaining agreements. So actually, in terms of the just transition debates and how we can influence these, there's what, 3/4 of our members actually not represented at all within unions. So we don't really have such a strong voice at the table. Right, so where are we now? This is my last slide. The Labour Party are gearing up to govern. I don't know how much you're following politics in the UK at the moment, but obviously with things like Brexit and other issues going on, the collapse of privatisation, which obviously is very helpful. I mean, it's significantly collapsing right across a number of sectors in the UK. Carillion collapsed at the beginning of the year, which was the PPI company, which does a lot of construction. It has huge amounts of public sector contracts. They've had to take some of the railway industry back into public hands because, again, the failure of privatised contracts. So the Labour Party now is trying to gear itself up for an election at any time and making sure they can, if they go into office, they've got their policies in place. There's lots of meetings going on at the moment. I would just point out, unfortunately, there's not consensus across the board within the Labour Party. And I think on one extreme, there's a group certainly working in the shadow Treasury team that would like to see a bigger vision for the Labour Party, particularly in terms of climate change and the economy. It wants to see, say, by 2050, where do we want to be? What do we want the UK economy looking like in terms of the energy and climate change debates, to very sort of conservative. And obviously we've got what we call the moderates and the Blairites from old Labour that are still trying to destabilise the left leadership at the moment. TUED engagement, so with Sean's help, has done an enormous job of work in the UK of bringing unions together, big unions, Unite, I'm sure it's the second biggest union now, but Unison, public sector union, G&B, big energy union, bringing us together in meetings and actually discussing some of these really hard issues. We had a meeting in February in London, then in June in the Midlands of Britain with some European comrades as well and allies, which TUED for us in the UK is providing the space to have some of the really difficult conversations which we're not having elsewhere, so we can actually get together with the gas unions and have a comradely debate about the future of gas in the energy mix, some of the just transition debates, and understanding some of the complexities around the public ownership issues in the energy transition. The TUC is not providing any of that space. It's just representing affiliates' interests very directly. So TUED has been playing a fantastic role for us in the UK, enabling some of this progress to happen. The Labour Party has presented its plans to the trade unions and how it sees public ownership and the democratic control of the energy system. I can't say too much about that because that's quite confidential at the moment, but they are going to be producing a report in the autumn, which again, they're going to consult with trade unions first, but that's been a good opportunity for the trade unions to actually share some of their concerns, particularly around the supply side. But we've still got a number of tensions going on there. We've had a discussion on just transition in the TUC, basically because as a result of the motion last year. I was at that discussion. I wouldn't say it was a particularly encouraging discussion. Unfortunately, there's not a progressive vision. And I think, again, it was said earlier, one of the problems we lack in the UK trade union is a collective vision about how we see the future and where we fit within that. And I think what's happening at the moment is what I call a bit of energy protectionism and trade union protection of their own models and their own industrial models that we are going to have to break free of. And some people have coined this term, what's a just transition for trade unions? But unless we challenge some of our own organising and industrial bases, we're not going to move out of this sort of paradigm into the future that we believe needs to exist, and obviously not just in the UK, but collectively. So I think, yeah, that was the last one. Thank you.
I think we're trying to get a bit of air into the room. Could use it, right? Don't you think? It's a bit hot. Use this way. This way. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Daniel. Perhaps dim the lights, if that's okay. Would that be all right? Oh, Daniel's going to do that, right? And dim the light. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sean Sweeney. I coordinate this project, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. It's now, as Fiona said earlier, it's about 65 unions from 22 countries. We came together in the beginning in 2012. NUMSA was in the room in New York 2 weeks before the Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast and killed 44 people in New York City in one day. So it was a reminder that climate change affects everybody. We came together because we didn't like the way the discussion were going with the NGOs and with some of the unions around a willingness to accept privatization of energy as a way of addressing climate change, of reducing emissions. We felt this was a false proposal and one that we should try to address. So I want to start, though, by saying that my goal in my first presentation is very limited, in the sense that I'm trying to reinforce what Daniel and Sam said earlier, in that the discussion here in South Africa about defending public ownership and extending public ownership to the renewable sector is of global significance. This is not just about the problems here. I'm sure comrades are aware that these issues are being raised all over the world, and there are remarkable similarities. Of course, there are important differences, but there are remarkable similarities across the world. So NUMSA put out this statement in 2012. I was fortunate to be in the room in Johannesburg, here in Johannesburg, talking about the need to struggle for social ownership. And also, SAFTU, in its founding statement, said that we would develop a position on the transition to socially owned renewable energy. So it's in that spirit that I offer these comments and these data, if you like. And there are two questions then. What can we learn about the global picture, and how can this strengthen the case for a radical energy democracy and a public vision in South Africa? And I think the global picture reinforces these demands. And I'm making three claims in this presentation. The first is that private renewable energy cannot deliver the levels of renewable energy needed to displace fossil fuels and bring about an energy transition. And that the reason why is because the neoliberal energy policy has not advanced renewables, but actually impeded their development. And that's a pretty contentious claim, but I'll come back to it in a moment. And that finally, and this will be developed more in the discussions later today and tomorrow, reaching clean energy and climate targets will require decisive actions by governments, beginning with the abolition of competitive electricity markets. So I'm going to say more about the first two claims and focus on the third claim maybe a little later, later today and tomorrow. So private renewable energy cannot deliver the levels of renewable energy needed. That's the claim. Now, obviously, this runs counter to the narrative coming out of the liberal capitalist establishment, which says that the energy transition is inevitable, it is well underway, and that really anybody investing in fossil fuels are making a very, very big mistake, because we are the future. And this is Al Gore saying we're winning. This is Ban Ki-moon, the outgoing Director General of the UN. And look closely at these quotes, because they really do reveal a lot. We have entered a new era. The progression to low emission, climate resilient growth is inevitable, beneficial and already underway. The large NGOs, mainstream NGOs, many good people are in those NGOs, they've gone along with it as well. The clean energy revolution is already underway. Renewable energy is breaking global records, etc. So if this is true, then... I'm sorry, comrade? Go back to this one. Photo op. Do you want me in this one?
You'll send the presentations to everybody.
So this is the narrative that is also very much part of the debate in South Africa. It says that renewable energy is becoming, the costs are going down, it's becoming more competitive. And if this was true, if the transition was inevitable, then our job as unions and social movements would be primarily to look after the interests of workers and communities, to make sure that the transition was fair, make sure it was just. And but the actual transition itself would be taken care of by the private sector and by the forces of capital, if it were true. And that means, though, anybody then saying, well, what about our communities in coal? What about, and resisting coal closures, are then part of the problem, not part of a solution. So it immediately puts anybody fighting for jobs, particularly in the fossil fuel sector, are considered to be obstructing this transition. And I think this is very important to reframe this in a way that we are not on the defensive, but we actually point to the realities of the failures of the neoliberal policy. Now, this kind of, I think, in one slide sums up, and Daniel's slides did the same, where things stand. That band there, actually is not the blue, but the green, and the green band is wind and solar in the electricity markets. That's their share at the moment. So you can see that fossil fuels and nuclear are still overwhelmingly dominant in the power sector globally, despite a significant growth in renewable energy. Compare that to where things need to go. These are the emissions levels. The blue line is if we don't do anything. The emissions levels, which is primarily the need for renewable energy, is driven by the climate argument and the need to control emissions. Yes, it makes air cleaner. We have less pollution, less particulates. That's an important thing. But the main reason is it's to decarbonize the power sector and then the whole economy, transport, buildings. And so renewable energy is counted on to deliver a safe planet from climate change. Now, business as usual is the blue line. The Paris commitments, you can see, are that sort of reddish line. That's where the emissions will be if all the commitments made by governments under Paris are honored. Clearly not good enough. And then those two lines coming down are what it would take to get to 1.5 degrees of warming. That's the lowest line, or 2 degrees. So you can see the emissions are going in the wrong direction. Now, that means there's something clearly wrong with the policy. If the commitments are to have emissions rise less slowly than business as usual, but rise nonetheless, then we are looking at a civilizational catastrophe that must be avoided. Now, part of it is the growth of renewable energy globally needs to be seen in the context of rising energy use. So if energy use is rising 2-3% a year globally, yes, renewables are growing, but so is coal, so is oil, so is gas, so is nuclear. And this is it's not an energy transition, it's an energy expansion. More and more energy coming into the system. Now, so the second claim, so we can see by the results that whatever the policy has been, the neoliberal approach, it's not done anything to impede the rise of emissions, and it hasn't driven renewables into the system at a speed sufficient to address the emissions crisis. Neoliberal energy policy has not advanced renewables, but impeded their development. Let's look at this. Now, it's important, I think, to know what are the main components of neoliberal approaches to the energy transition. The first thing is there are essentially two features. The first one is the private sector must lead. This is Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank. He articulated more than any other person, he articulated the neoliberal approach to reducing emissions. This becomes the logic of groups like the European Commission. Note this, the date, 11 years ago, a competitive market will help fight climate change. The emissions trading scheme, an important measure for cutting emissions, will only function in a competitive market environment. So here we see an explicit connection between the privatization of electricity and reducing emissions. So that's an important ideological connection they've made. So if you're against this privatization, you must be against reducing emissions, because that's the political logic of this argument. It's a flawed argument. Now, Stern said there are two approaches. One is we put a price on the emissions, called the polluter pays principle. We've heard a lot of this even in progressive movements. The polluter should pay. Well, what does that mean, the polluter should pay? It means that if I've got the money to pay, I can carry on polluting. Is that good for the planet? Is that good for the people of the planet? No, it's not good. Of course, what we found out, of course, that the polluters aren't willing to pay. And this is the carbon price in the largest carbon market in the world, the European emissions trading system. Now, that price, in fairness, has gone up a little bit in recent years. This was January 2016. It's now gone up to around 20 euros a ton because of the economic growth. Won't go into the details. But basically speaking, it's been a failure, a catastrophic failure. Here's a global picture, a chart we produced in New York. This is World Bank data. Every year, they look at carbon pricing and carbon markets, and they try to say, is this policy, is it making progress? And they try to say that it is, but look, 14 or so, 15% of emissions in the world are covered by a price. The rest is not priced. So that's failure number one. 12 years after carbon pricing got started, we're still looking at a very small fraction of the world's emissions covered by a price. Second, and this is even more significant, the blue says that the red is less than $10 a ton of carbon dioxide. Now, this all may sound a bit technical, but what it really means is $10 a ton is not enough of a price to change investment patterns. All it means is the $10 that the company is charged to pollute gets passed on downstream to working people and consumers. So it doesn't change investment, it doesn't reduce emissions, and it's been a catastrophic failure. But it's one that the ruling elite persists with, saying we need a carbon price, we need a carbon price. We're not going to get a carbon price. This is a neoliberal fantasy, and we need to confidently assert that that is the case. Now, so then, how then did some areas like Europe, Daniel referred to Germany, how did it develop its renewable energy? You can see renewable energy is growing, energy consumption is falling, greenhouse gases are falling. And thus Europe becomes the model of a capitalist energy transition, using the neoliberal, using the approach that we described. So if it's not the carbon price, how did renewable energy grow in Europe? Here's first of all, the success story. 16.4% energy consumed come from renewable sources. Renewable investment rose 600%, 1.1 trillion invested in large-scale renewable installations. So these are the numbers that show that say, oh, it's working. If it can work in Europe, it can work elsewhere. As has been pointed out already, Germany is the leader. 38 gigawatts of solar installed. They called it a solar miracle. This is a very interesting chart. This is cumulative. When solar reached 100 gigawatts of global installation, that's quite a lot of solar. Germany had almost a third of those installations. One country with not that much sun has a third of the installations. So again, if Germany can do it, why can't everybody else do it? Here we have a headline, relatively recent, 18th of February 2016, Germany's renewable energy revolution. Can it happen in the United States? Now, The two main reasons for Europe's success is mitigation of risk, which is kind of policy wonky language that says that you'll guarantee that anybody investing in renewable energy will make a profit. So you take the risk out of the investment and what they call out-of-market measures. So remember what they said about competitive electricity markets? Well, in the case of renewables, it was the feed-in tariff. Anybody generating renewable energy, small or large generators, were guaranteed to have their electricity purchased by either a government agency or the utility. This is the model that's happening in South Africa now. It's the independent power producer model. The risk is on the public entity. The profits are guaranteed and locked in through this out-of-market measure. Who paid for the subsidies? This is Europe, but I think it's saying what I've heard about South Africa. I think it's here is the same. The tariffs get passed on, the subsidies get passed on in the price of electricity. Certainly in Europe, this is the case. The prices were passed on. You can see there with the countries with the highest penetration of renewables, Denmark and Germany, have the highest electricity charges. Up to a third of a German electricity bill is paying for the subsidies for renewables. So the feed-in tariff that benefits property owners, landowners, these tariffs get passed on to consumers. You might say, well, what's the problem with that? We got to pay for this transition. Well, yes, that's true, but it means that it's a redistribution of wealth upward to those who already have money, for the most part, from people who don't have it. And then along comes a Donald Trump, not in Europe, but there are plenty of Donald Trumps in Europe now, winning elected office, saying, oh, look at your electricity bill. Why? Because this green climate change stuff, and it's all a complete lie and a hoax, and we should get rid of it, which is one of the reasons why the right wing in Europe gained ground. It wasn't the main reason. The main reason was immigration, but one of the reasons was an attack on the renewable energy systems. Here's electricity prices in Germany. Who gained from the subsidies? There's some quotes here. I don't have time to go into it, but clearly the large companies, the large developers developed from the subsidies more than ordinary people. Now, one of the other failures of the neoliberal system is the effect it had on the rest of the energy system. And this is playing out very, very clearly here. Eskom could be the best public entity in the world, and it still would be affected by these things if the privatization of renewables and the subsidy of renewables was allowed to proceed. So even though Eskom has problems, big, major, catastrophic problems, and needs to be radically reformed, the utilities are facing similar problems in other parts of the world. This is the US and EU utilities. The EU utilities, half their share values, stock values, were wiped off the board in just a few years as a result of what they call disruptive competition from renewable energy companies. These companies there were protected from the market, but their utilities were not protected. So when the wind blew all day and the sun shines all day, all the prices go down immediately. So they have to buy cheap power. They recover none of their own costs. But when the sun goes in and the winter sets in, everybody wants to come back to the grid and the centralized generators. And so those power generators need to be available for when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. So then what happened, and this is an important change in policy, they got rid of the feed-in tariff. They said we need to control how much renewables comes into the system. So this is what I mean by policy impeding renewables. So they went to a system of auctioning or competitive bidding. And that was introduced in Europe in 2013. But as goes policy colonialism, we've seen it with the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, so too with this policy. You see the green there are 48 countries who are doing auctions, and the blue is 27 countries who are considering auctions as a way of driving renewables. What does this mean, auctions? It means that renewable energy companies must compete against each other to win contracts with energy purchaser, which in this case would be Eskom. So these contracts are awarded based on a competitive bidding system. What did this do? First of all, you saw situations where the cost of renewable energy goes down quite dramatically. Look at, these are different countries where they've had auctions, and you'll see what is called dive bidding, which is where companies bid very, very low, win the contract, and then later on will try to renegotiate the contract. Now everybody else has lost interest. So that's one problem. But even if you forget dive bidding, what you see is these falling costs of renewables, which the renewables industry says, see, look, our costs are falling, we are the future. But here's a question I think that should be in all of our minds. If competitive bidding could have lowered those costs that much, why were those costs so high in the first place? Why were the power purchase agreements and subsidies set at such a level that there was so much profit, and that profits were basically paid for on the electricity bills of ordinary people? So this is India. You can see the auction levels going down there. Now, one of the consequences of competitive bidding, and yet another failure of the current policy, is that it has dampened investment, because the investors don't really care about climate targets. They don't care about whether Europe reaches its target or not, or whether the world reaches the Paris target. That is not their concern. Their primary concern, their only concern, is to get a return on investment. So they look at those falling auction prices and say, how are we going to make any money out of this? If we invest in this with those margins, there's not going to be much of a return. But there's political risk in investing in renewable energy because they depend on these subsidies. They depend on a government or a utility being told that they have to purchase the power. What if the political winds change and these subsidies get wiped out? That means we put all this money into renewables, but we won't get it returned. So you can see, if you look at the 2011 figures, the 2017 figures were barely above it, hardly above it at all, in fact, a little bit lower. The most recent data shows a further decline in investment in clean energy. But where competitive bidding has really established itself, you can see it's even more catastrophic, the fall in investment. This is Europe. Again, look at 2011 figures, 137 billion. Look at the figures for 2017. Competitive bidding has driven investment out of the renewable sector. Look at the solar industry in Germany, in Europe. The yellow there in 2011, that ban, that solar investment, look at it on the final column, 2017, completely collapsed. Here is Germany by sector. Again, look at the solar miracle. Look on the right there, the yellow band, 2017. Why is the solar miracle? Why did this happen? Why did investment collapse in solar in Germany? This is Japan, the same phenomenon. This is the UK, a precipitous decline in investment. Only 3 member states, that's European Union, will reach their Paris targets. Germany will miss its climate targets disastrously. So the point of these data is to say that the idea of competitive markets are dead. They cannot deliver the kind of investment needed. By subsidizing renewables in order to make them competitive, what that did was it turned into a situation where public money was being used to build up a private industry, and the costs were being picked up by the public on electricity bills. So that's problem number 1. It also meant that the utilities were so starved of revenues that they also then, to compensate, raised prices for electricity. This is what we're seeing in the context of South Africa as well. So you're seeing the utilities are caught in the situation where, because they're losing market share, they then lose investment and have to raise prices. So reaching clean energy and climate targets will require decisive action by governments, beginning with the abolition of the competitive electricity markets. To be honest, this is not a very careful formulation. The competitive electricity markets in many parts of the world are over. What has happened is everything is subsidized now. If you disrupt the utilities then go to the government and say, you are driving us out of business. Do you want to drive us out of business? Because if you do that, the lights won't be on tomorrow. Because if you're relying on intermittent wind and solar power, then you are going to be facing darkness. And are you going to be able to deal with that? And then the governments all over the world are saying, well, no, I guess not. They say, well, listen, it's about time you agree to buy our power at a level that is out of market and protected from the competition. So you see governments all over the world subsidizing the extension of coal, gas, and nuclear in order to make sure that when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, there's enough capacity in the system to keep the lights on. Also, investment in that centralized system has collapsed. So by guaranteeing these capacity payments, you try to get money, private investors to come back into the traditional utilities. This, I think, is a catastrophic policy failure. So when people say renewables are the future, the private sector will lead, it's inevitable, please show them some of this information. Be confident that this has been a big monumental failure. Renewable energy is growing far, far too slowly to reach the climate targets. Its technical potential is far higher than what is being delivered. And the only way we're going to do that is if we have serious, planned, public, I would call socialist energy approach. Here's the few more slides and then I'll be quiet. International Energy Agency. This quote should have made headline news, not Al Gore saying we're winning. Market-based, unsubsidized, low-carbon investments have been negligible. What does that tell you about the private sector must lead? It confirms that the private sector will only invest if they're guaranteed profits, and those profits are paid for by public subsidies. South Africa. Private renewables will not deliver a new energy system in South Africa or globally. We've already seen this already playing out. Therefore, South Africa is not a holdout standing in the way of an inevitable transition. It can be on the cutting edge of a new pro-public and needs-based approach. Going back to the Paris targets, these are the targets we need to reach. This is part of a global narrative for energy transition. And now you see also, here's the OECD, not known for its radicalism, right? The current designs of wholesale liberalized electricity markets are often not strategically aligned with a low carbon transition. The market design has also brought fragmentation in clean energy investment and financing. So I don't have time to go into all the other details, but I do urge you to be part of the TUED network if you're a trade union or if you're a labor policy organization. We've got, be part of it so you can be part of these debates. The issue that we're going to take up later on this afternoon and tomorrow is what does a modern public utility, a democratic utility look like? How can it drive renewable energy from a needs-based and a public goods approach? How can we promote that as an alternative to the failed neoliberal policy and the IPPs unfolding, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere? So thanks for your time.
So Danielle, Sam, and Sean, thank you very much.
Sorry.
That was impressive. But very informative, and I think if we're going to go forward, we've got to do it from an informed base and not from a base of wishful thinking or believing the propaganda that's out there. So thank you very much for that. I'm told by Sandra that we can hang on for another half an hour for lunch. Is that okay? Because I think we haven't really had much time for discussion today, and the reason you're all here is that we want to have debates, we want to engage, and we want to understand better. So if it's okay with you, we'll keep going for another half an hour. Who would like to comment, ask for a point of clarity, raise something? Right, so you'll have.
Yeah, I'd like to firstly thank all three presenters. It was really very helpful, very useful. There was a lot of good insights into this discussion. And there's one, maybe three questions that I have, which I'd like sort of further clarity on. One is if Daniel could say a little bit more about the kind of private-public process in the Uruguay transition. Just stated that so much is private, etc. It'd be interesting to see how it played out in Uruguay and what impact, if any, it had on developing some sort of manufacturing sector in Uruguay relative to the renewable energy sector. Secondly, I think it would be very interesting to get, I don't know if Sean or any other of the presenters have a sense, but the growth of renewable energy in China, can you characterize that? Because I would imagine it's much more public driven, but I do know that there's strong private components to it, and it'd be interesting to see how the contradictions, particularly around investment levels, played out in China. For the moment, I forget what my third question is.
Those are good ones. Thanks. Covered the board.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentations. We must start by appreciating, because this information is very helpful. Just want to check on the last presentation. In fact, in all the presentations, is there any emphasis that, because I seem to capture that there is a gap with regards to raising, when you talk energy democracy, mentioning the issue of gender involvement in that democracy. I'll just make an example. Where we are, poverty is very bad, and it's also extremely bad with our female counterparts, comrades. And if you are going to do anything in the economy, including energy democracy, there should be a slot perhaps where gender gets mentioned specifically, and we deal with issues inclusive of being sensitive of the fact that even with food security, when you talk food security, and you don't include gender, you are leaving a component that perhaps we don't need to ignore. That is one part. The other one is a question that we, perhaps somebody in the room has got certain answers. Because I captured that there are declines in the investment patterns. And I think, can we go all-inclusive and all-exhaustive, if we can, around this room, finding out reasons exactly why that is the case? It will be very, very important to unearth some of these reasons. Maybe it is something that is avoidable. Maybe it's something that when we build policies or we try to play in the policy formulation or critiquing the policy, that we need to be able to look at what is it exactly that is causing this all over the globe. I'm saying this because I've seen it is consistent in all the presentations.
Thank you, Mbodi. David in Bish.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I mean, to follow on a little bit, how much of the picture that we're being showed of disinvestment or fall off in investment, is that it only in the private sector? Does it reflect what states are doing? Secondly, when we ask how do we account for it, is it due to recession? Is it a long-term trend, or will the trend reverse once recession is less onerous? And in general, how can we build a clear projection of where it's going, both private and public, so that we have a sense of you know, maybe a 50-year horizon or a 40-year horizon. And if we are going to be trying to build a picture of the transition and what a fair and a just transition would be, we really need to know that.
Thank you. Let's see, Vision Martin, and then I'll give it back to Sam.
Thank you to the presenters. Just 2 points. I think besides accounting for the kind of neoliberal disabling of renewable energy, we should also try and account for the neoliberal success of fossil fuels and try to explain and understand it. So, you know, you have Trump accelerating fossil fuel extraction to the point where the US is surpassing Saudi Arabia and Russia as the largest fossil fuel producer in the world. And you know, there's clearly an upward swing in the price of oil and things like that, making it lucrative investments. But what are the limits and what are the contradictions around that? You know, given that at the same time climate determinism is kicking in, you know, wildfires in the US and things like that, and so maybe we need to problematize how far this fossil fuel sort of domination of global markets can continue. But my second point is around other examples. So, you know, Ireland has declared that it's going renewable energy. What is the story there in the island context? And I've picked up somewhere about geothermal in Iceland, and then of course Swaziland has hydro and so on. What are the other examples, and even in local communities, that we can learn from for the kind of politics we need to go?
Thank you. My first question goes to Daniel. The case study you presented to us, if I got you right, was the fact that Uruguay has almost privatized the energy sector. What I would like you to assist us is in understanding what has been the real impact on consumer prices, consumers, and employment in particular, because I'm biased towards that. If privatization was 100% or 90%, what can we learn in terms of employment and the net effect to consumers? And then on the presentation on the UK, I would like some clarification on the decline in union membership. To what extent can that be attributed to the energy transition over and above other factors? Because I think it's a very critical aspect to note for this process. Thank you.
Yeah, I have Sandile, I have Barbie, and I have Aisha. But perhaps you three wouldn't mind holding on till we get back to the.
Yes, I will begin by saying that in Uruguay, there was no privatization. In fact, in 2004, we became the first country on earth that managed to stop privatization through a referendum. That was in 1996, when we collected the signatures. And then in 2004, we changed the constitution, another referendum, to prevent the privatization of water. And it says that only the state can be the provider of essential services such as the one I mentioned. When we talk about privatization, we talk about privatization of the wind sector. And still, we have to be careful when we talk about privatization. Can you take that? Because there hasn't been such a privatization. And that's the debate that we have with the trade union about terms. So the transition began in 2004. This is the year, a picture I took when we were celebrating the triumphs of the left, and I begin to answer Brian's question. And to be honest, and Sebastian can say more about this because he was part of the government, the left didn't have a very coherent strategy for the energy sector. And in fact, there were different proposals. The president, the current president, the first one who was elected, was relying on nuclear energy. Remember that, Sebastian? But then there was some discussion, and the idea was to go to the transition through renewable. But the main force still remains the public state-owned national utility, which is a vertically integrated public utility that takes care of generation, distribution, commercialization, is 100% state-owned, so it hasn't been privatized. It's quite efficient, both financially and socially. There is almost no corruption. There has been corruption in other public enterprises, but not in this one. And in fact, the quality of services is quite high. Blackouts are almost unthinkable in Uruguay. 3 weeks ago, there was a big blackout in Montevideo, and everybody was angry with the national company because they had forgotten that 20 years ago, blackouts were almost constant. So it was like a surprise that this was not supposed to happen. And then there is very high coverage of electricity services and a very strong and radical trade union. But in terms of privatization of the wind sector, this is what worries me. This is private. This is public. And why the green part couldn't be 100%? In fact, the public utility wanted to do it all as a state program, as a public program. But as it happened in other governments of Latin America, where the left has been in government, the governments are quite schizophrenic. There are some parts of the government that are quite radical, quite progressive, and there are some other parts of the government that we can call them neoliberal. The Ministry of Finances of Uruguay didn't allow the public utility to invest more. So establish a limit to what it could invest. So the public utility was forced to think of non-traditional forms of public investment. So this is the only part that is direct public investment. These are more creative forms, like bonds and share issues by the public utility, for instance, leasing, joint ventures with local operators and that kind of thing. So that's the real problem.
I think these are wind farms. They are not investment, because investment is 3 billion and 4 billion.
Yes, this is
wind farms.
Here we are talking only about wind farm.
These are not yet.
Yeah, that's good.
These are the figures, the investment figures. So let's say we have 40 wind farms, and this is the distribution of these wind farms, private and state in different ways. So let's say we have one which is state-owned, yeah, wind farms.
But the state has invested quite a lot. But the problem is that also the Ministry of Finances sees the public utility, the equivalent of Eskom, as a cash cow, because it's a very efficient company. So if the public utility would invest in building new wind farms, that would be less money to transfer to the national treasury. And in fact, for a small country like Uruguay, less than 4 million people, what the public utility invests is quite a lot. For instance, last year was almost 500 million euros that were to the national treasury. That money could have been invested, perhaps, in building state-owned national park. And the other possibility was for the public utility to go to the international credit market, because this public utility, the equivalent of Eskom, has AAA plus credit rating. So it has a very good credit rating. But the Ministry of Finances, again, a neoliberal government, didn't allow it. Yeah, the other question is about David. That's a very interesting question about public and private. I guess Sean has more to say about that. The first thing I would say is that it's not always easy to make the distinction between what is public and what is private. For instance, in the electricity sector in Europe, we have state-owned companies that outside their countries, they behave like any private multinational. For instance, the city of Berlin was fighting against the privatization of electricity in the city, and it was fighting against a transnational corporation that was state-owned, that was Vattenfall from Sweden. So is Sweden a public utility, a public company, or is it a private company? But in terms of public investment, I don't know about globally, maybe Sean has more figures, but at least in Latin America, there has been much more public investment in the energy sector and in the electricity sector than private. For instance, Costa Rica is still investing quite a lot in expanding its electricity system and improving its electricity system. And as I say, it's fully owned. I already presented the cases of Uruguay. In the case of Bolivia, there was a renationalization of the whole electricity sector. It began with a sun plant, and then it took the national grid. They took it from Spanish company. In Venezuela, electricity has been fully renationalized. It has been a failure. We can talk about that maybe at some other moment. But it also showed that there was a lot of public-state investment.
Sean and Sam, I think there were quite a lot of people, especially.
I can come in on the investment.
Brian,
David raised that point. In the paper, the TUED paper, Preparing a Public Pathway Addressing the Investment Crisis in Renewable Energy, there's quite a lot of data there about the investment figures. And it's interesting the way it's been broken down. The main story is that on paper, it looks like the private sector is about 2/3 of investment and the public is 1/3. But in the private sector is included residential investment. So in a sense, that's members of the public for the most part who are investing in their own generation, and they're responding to a public subsidy. So in other words, public money is being used to get them to put up solar panels on roofs. If you took that out, it's about 50-50 in terms of the public and private. What we're seeing, though, is a drift more towards the public. The largest single cost for renewable energy is the cost of finance, of borrowing money. And what has happened is that private companies have said the essence of a public-private partnership in energy now, and it was different years ago, is that the public entity guarantees the loan and gets access to low-interest loans because it's a public entity. But that money then is packaged in a power purchase agreement, so the benefits of that low finance loan goes towards the private company in the form of a power purchase agreement. This is one of the reasons why the cost of renewable energy has gone down. The headlines show that, oh, that's because we're so innovating all the time and we're getting better wind turbines and better solar panels, and therefore competition is making the prices go low. That's true to a point. There have been technological changes, particularly in the wind sector, where much bigger turbines now for offshore wind generate higher levels of efficiency. But for the most part, I would say that those costs are falling because of the access to public finance through a public-private partnership and a power purchase agreement. I don't know if I have time to go into the other questions at this time. I can stand back and wait and see. Because the questions about China as well, that I don't want to hog too much.
Yeah, maybe you can go quickly.
I can do China.
I think
really
China's
fast.
quite important.
Yes, China. 2016 data showed that renewable energy investment had begun to really collapse in Europe. But the Bloomberg New Energy Finance and the sort of green growth gurus said, but don't worry, because China put 50 billion, the equivalent of $50 billion US into its renewable energy sector, and therefore kept it on an even keel. What's happened, though, the way they did the investment is as follows. First of all, interest-free loans or very, very low interest loans for anybody private who wants to come into the business of renewables. A feed-in tariff, again, so you guarantee that they will pay above market price for renewable power. So in many senses, they borrowed the policies from Europe, because it was succeeding in Europe, in order to develop a very vibrant renewable energy industry. But one of the main goals, and this is why there's a protectionist fight between the US and China at the moment over solar in particular, is that these interest-free or low-interest loans lower the cost, and it means that cheap solar PV coming at solar photovoltaics, 50% of the market now is Chinese, and it's basically being importers of solar all over the world want to use Chinese solar because it lowers the cost and therefore raises their possibilities of margins. The sting in the tail, though, for China is the cost of the feed-in tariff has become so high, the investment was so rapid that they're now cutting the feed-in tariff and they're going to an auction system. The same process that I described in my presentation. And what is expected, the solar industry is saying this will mean a serious drop-off in Chinese investment. And how are we going to deal with this drop-off with Europe also now in a nosedive? So it's very concerning for the solar industry in particular that that there's going to be a glut in solar PV, which will temporarily lower the price, but the investment figures will probably dry up. So it's an economic concern, I think, which it's germane and pertinent to the conversation we're having here about South Africa's options.
Thank you. Sure.
Hopefully that was helpful.
Sam, is there anything? There was a question about Ireland. We know you're from the UK and not Ireland, but.
Well, I've been answering a couple of questions, but I always want an Ireland. I just, I actually thought the one on gender was really important to answer. And thank you for raising that, because we often don't talk about some of the gender inequalities issues. Just to say quickly, in the PCS pamphlet, actually one of the things we talk in here as part of National Climate Service is having an equality commission, so that every decision of government in relation to energy and the energy transition and public ownership is kind of gender-proof, if you like. At the moment in the UK, we have something called the Equality and Human Rights Commission that's been sort of highly diminished in its role. We also have something called a public sector equality duty, which anybody in the public sector is supposed to carry out in terms of contracts, but that rarely ever happens. But that was really with a view to making sure that any policy decisions don't negatively impact particular groups in society, whether it's disabled, whether it's gender related, etc. So that's what we put in there. So we, in terms of our discourse, certainly do talk about that, and also the future jobs as well, because obviously there's been enormous genderisation of job roles in the UK, and that's I'm sure the same here, typifying the women's working care, working low paid, skilled, etc. So the other one I just thought really important to answer, and so the reason why I'm avoiding the Irish question is not just because of frictionless borders and stuff like this. I know there was the move to divest from fossil fuels, which has been really good, but I must admit I haven't had time to properly catch up on what kind of alternatives are they're proposing. But there's some really good trade unions in Ireland that are actually organising around just transition questions, which is really important. On the trade union membership decline, I mean, obviously that's not an unfamiliar story across industrialised nations, and in the UK, particularly with the deindustrialisations of the 80s and 90s and privatisation programmes, it saw huge swathes of workers, and particularly the coal sector in the 80s and 90s is where we lost lots of members, and the steel sector, so where the trade unions had traditionally organised in those sectors where we lost large numbers of members. But also more recently is across the public sector with privatisations and trying to sort of break up and fragment around there. I mean, probably also worth just to mention in the UK, we have some of the most anti-trade union laws, not just in Europe, but in the world, and it's getting even harder to actually go on strike and just organise workers, which is very difficult. And coming back to the Bakers Union that I mentioned earlier, probably having one of the most progressive campaigns at the moment with the McDonald's and fast food workers, which I think is a real inspiration to everybody to see them organising that group. And I think just one thing I had meant to say in my presentation, which is also relevant as well, but around the renewable sector, there is quite a lot of hostility to the growth of the renewable sector among UK energy unions, because the jobs in there tend to be ununionised. Now, partly we say, well, it's up to you to go and organise in there, and my union can't do that. But on the other hand, a lot of it is small scale. But also a lot of the jobs in the renewable sector, and that there's been a really important piece of research that's just been done, it's not been published yet, looking at job quality across the renewable sector, doing a comparative study in the UK, Denmark and Germany, and found across all three countries, which was a little bit of a surprise, particularly thinking of Germany and Denmark, there's high levels of agency worker use, poor pay, not good terms and conditions, use of short-term contracts, different wage rates, etc. So across the industry, I mean, particularly in the European context, they're not developing good unionised jobs. And so some of the energy unions are actually using this as an argument against the development of the renewable sector. But obviously for us, as we say, well, it should be public sector renewables development as well. And just refreshing my memory, there was an occupation of a factory up in Scotland last year by the workers who were actually producing wind turbine blades. They don't just do some renewables work, they also do work around the offshore oil platforms as well. But the company was pulling out, and all those jobs were going to go. So the workers actually did an occupation of the factory and what's called work-in to keep the production lines going. With some intervention of the Scottish government, they did actually rescue those jobs. Now I've just read that those jobs actually are now going, because that was only for the lifetime of that contract. So it looks like that company is going to close, even though it's still got some marginal Scottish government investment in there. So I think, again, it's this argument whether if that was a public sector and a publicly owned company, then actually those workers could be put to work building the wind turbines and the infrastructure which we need, which we argue for in terms of the renewable sector.
Thanks, Dan. Very quickly, because we're getting 13:26. I had Comrade Sandile, Aisha, and Ubabi, and then Aisha. It's my order.
No, thanks, ma'am. Most of it was being covered. But my main concern is that I heard from the three presenters. The part that I wanted to know, how was the trade unions and government relationship in fighting to pursue the transformation including workers, vis-a-vis communities and civil people, because at the end of the day, you feel there was you saw the structures that shrink. There was a growth of energy cleansing, but 2011 is a dropping to today. And the question, the how part, what caused the drop, and then there was also where he also mentioned the issue of the polluters paying the penalties. The question is, how did that part being won, and who was controlling those penalties, and who are the beneficiaries on that? Vis-a-vis our South African situation, I think GS did mention about 22 spots in Mpumalanga, the upcoming power stations and everything. And the other thing is that the political will, was any political will government willing to work with the unions serving the interests of the people, or it was just because they do get the profits and only certain percentage to achieve this. I think if you also understand when Sweeney said that when there was a instability, the company started swinging the back to their favor. So, and now coming to our country here, in this level, we're talking at a distance. We are here talking amongst ourselves. On the 28th, there was a policy document on climate change that was, the question is, where the community may be involved, and what the progress going forward. The damage has been done. So there will be a certain resistance, but we need to neutralize. So that's why my asking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Sandile. Aisha. Ubabi.
Okay. Just on the point that Bish made was how is it that coal etc. is being is succeeding, and I think we cannot not talk about the big multinationals like Glencore. Rio Tinto is disinvesting from its coal. It's handing over its coal assets, and Glencore is buying them up. So Glencore is got to be one of the most powerful multinationals in the extractive sector, and it's going to be a formidable force to push back against coal when you're facing what was very much against Glencore. the one point. The second is, we keep talking about South Africa, and I'm concerned that when we talk about South Africa, we cannot talk about South Africa. We have to talk about Southern Africa because we have a connected grid as Southern Africa. So what happens in South Africa affects what happens in Southern Africa, and just as much as what also happens in our neighboring countries affects South Africa. At the moment, the coal reserves in Botswana are estimated at 200 billion. As of 2017, investment in coal is kicking off in Botswana. Botswana is looking at setting up its own power station all across the Southern African region. There's talk in Southern African countries about less reliance on South Africa for its energy, and that means they will invest in energy. And companies like Glencore are talking and whispering in government's ears that investment will be in coal. In a country like Botswana, which entire economy has run on the mines and been in decline with the declining diamonds, the fact that you can now turn to coal, it's something that they know, it's something that they're comfortable with. So unless we're willing to push our strategy beyond the borders of South Africa, Southern Africa itself has the potential to take down, to put so much coal into the global pot that we will be the heart of burning down, taking down on carbon emissions.
Thanks, Ash. Sebastian, you're going to have to keep yours for lunch.
Okay.
Gabi, last.
Quickly. The commercial service union fell from 300 to 180,000 members. The overall picture in the UK, as you painted, is a terrible free fall of membership of unions. I would have thought that would happen in 1985, during the Thatcher era. We're seeing it's happening from 1995 and around to 2016. What is the reason? If you can just explain. Is it internal? Unions are too focused, too much involved in something else other than service workers? Is it external? Lots of restrictions on the right to organize? What is it?
Very quickly, because it's 3 minutes over our half hour. Maybe Brian can pick up in the next session. Ish. Or at least in the discussion there. And Sangilia's question was also asked by David and some others earlier. Yeah, it's kind of, I was thinking we might get Sean to write a really good paper that we can.
Is this on the collapse of the investment after 2011?
Yeah.
We already asked that.
Yeah. But I think it's not a question we're going to answer in a few seconds. So maybe that's in the course of the conference.
Answer in a few seconds.
You can.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm sorry if it wasn't clear in the original presentation. The investment has gone down because of the shift from the feed-in tariff subsidy to competitive bidding, where now renewable energy companies have to compete against each other, which means the prices have fallen, and that reduces the profit levels, which means the investors look at that and say, I don't think this is a good idea, and I'll invest in condominiums or whatever. And so that's one of the main reasons why the subsidies are politically precarious at the moment. And if they're removed, then renewables will not be able to compete with fossil fuels at the moment. And the investors know that, so they vote with their feet and run away from the industry.
Thanks, Sean. That's very, and Sam, would you like to answer Babi's question about reduced union density?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can do that quickly then.
You could also do it with them over lunch.
Yeah,